Hi, I'm Tara from Wild Bird Farm. Today we're going to talk about the toughest hardy annuals in Zone 5. So when we think of annuals, we sometimes think of warm, tender annuals like sunflowers and zinnias. But today we're going to talk about hardy annuals, sometimes known as cool flowers. This is a group of plants that loves getting their start in the cool season of spring. Before we dive in, I want to mention a couple of resources where you can learn more about these cool flowers, also known as hardy annuals. Lisa Mason Ziegler can be found at thegardenersworkshop.com. She also has a podcast called the Field and Garden Podcast, and I believe she's on YouTube also. She wrote the Cool Flowers book, which is where you can learn a lot more information on this topic. Secondly is Danielle from North Lawn Flower Farm on YouTube. Danielle is a wealth of information about a lot of gardening topics, but she talks about cool flowers, and I definitely recommend a listen. Okay, before we talk about the specific hardy annuals, there are a couple of things you'll want to know. A quick Google search will give you the answers that you need. First up is your hardiness zone. As I mentioned, I am in Iowa, Zone 5. We're right on the line between 5A and 5B, so I generally just say 5 to make it simple. The second thing you'll want to find is your frost dates. What is your first frost date in the autumn? Ours is generally the first to second week in October. So generally in my mind, I say October 7th to the 12th is a pretty safe bet. And then what is your last frost in the spring? Ours is generally around that second week in May. So maybe May 7th to May 12th is a pretty safe bet for us here. Those dates can vary even if you are in the same zone as me. If you're in Zone 5, your dates could vary depending on your location. So you will want to do a quick Google search and get these dates, and you may need to slide some of the dates I talk about later on depending on where you're at. Okay, so now that we know our first and last frost dates, we're going to grab a couple of key dates off our calendars. Counting backward from your last frost date or your first frost date, grab that 6 to 8 week window. Since hardy annuals are hardy and they want to get their roots developing while the season is still cool, we have a window where we can plant them out. I have found in Zone 5, generally 6 weeks is a good guide for planting out hardy annuals. This could mean direct sowing the seeds, or it could mean planting out seedlings. As we look at each specific variety, I will let you know if I plant out a plug or I direct sow. Keep in mind, if you're going to be planting out little plant starts, you'll need to account for that additional growing time. So when you get your 6 weeks before your last frost date in the spring, you'll need to count back 4 to 8 more weeks to account for that seedling growth. So let me say that a different way. Let's say in the spring in general, I'm going to plant out 6 weeks before my last frost date. Let's make it simple here and say that my last frost date is May 1. So I need to count back 6 weeks, which would be mid-March, to start those seeds. Sorry, there's a fly. And from that date, you'll need to look on your seed packet to see how long you need to start those seeds to get them to a seedling stage that you can plant out. Generally, that's 6 to 8 weeks. So if we're in mid-March now and we need to add on 6 more weeks to grow those seeds, we're looking at early February. So just an example here, but we're starting our seeds the 1st of February, so they're ready to be planted out 6 weeks later in mid-March, which is 6 weeks, mid-March to early May, before our last frost date. Sorry about the fly. Okay, now for the fun. First up is annual scabiosa, also known as pincushion flower. This is one of the hardiest plants I plant out in the spring. These went out the 3rd week of March this year, and this is what they look like today. I did cover them with a little bit of straw protection, but these guys are hardy. Pincushion flower comes in lots of fun colors, and also there is a stellata variety shown here that has great textural interest. Next up is snapdragons, and who doesn't love a snapdragon? There are lots of varieties and lots of colors. These were also started the 3rd week in March this year. They were covered with a little bit of straw protection. You could also use remay or row cover in these early weeks. Snapdragons belong to different families or groups. I believe it's 1 through 4. Read up on this because it is important to plant the right set of groups at the right time. I generally plant out group 3 in early spring for summer blooms. Next up is agrostemma or corncockle. There are beautiful varieties of white and purple and pink. These that you see here were planted out again that 3rd week in March. I also direct sowed some, and you'll see those here. These are really tough plants in our zone 5. And I guess I would recommend planting out plugs because they took so well to the temperatures this year. Next up is bachelor's buttons, one of the few true blue colors in our garden. These readily self-sow for me, as shown here. I did start some as plugs, and they're very similar to the corncockle in size. Bachelor's buttons also make great dried flowers. They really hold their color well. Experiment with what types of crafting you can do with them, and have some fun. Once again, these plugs were planted out the 3rd week in March and look great here a month later. Next up is Nigella or Love in a Mist. These self-sow so well in my area that I don't start them indoors anymore. Sometimes I'll throw some seed out, but it generally does all the work for me. While the flowers are beautiful, these are known for the fresh and dried seed pods. Next up is feverfew, and I consider this a short-lived perennial. It will die back and regrow for several years. I do like to put out fresh starts every other year or so to keep my patch looking healthy. This hardy annual is so hardy that you can actually plant it out 6 to 8 weeks before your first frost in the fall. It will overwinter, growing its roots, and in the spring it will give you beautiful blooms. I plant some out in the fall and in the spring here. Next up is yarrow, and if you've watched any of my videos, you know my love for yarrow runs deep. This is similar to feverfew in that it does perennialize here in Zone 5. It also self-sows and will work its way out of the garden beds if you don't keep track of it. You can fall plant this little plugs out into the soil 6 to 8 weeks before your first frost in the fall, or you can plant out in the spring. There are lots of colors and varieties, and this makes a great cut flower as well as a landscape plant. Our next hardy annual is chamomile. Yes, the chamomile that you can dry for teas. It's also a great landscape plant and great as a cut flower. Similar to yarrow, this can be planted out in the fall, in the spring, and it readily self-sows itself around the garden. Next up is another one of my favorites, dianthus, also called Sweet William. This I would also consider a short-lived perennial, although I do see more dieback than in some of the other varieties. I love to plant this out in early spring, March or April here, and you can use the foliage before it blooms in your bouquets. This is a must-have. I've got two more which I consider honorable mentions. The first is Bells of Ireland. This plant is also extremely hardy, and I planted this out in early March this year. I give this one an honorable mention mostly because I haven't had great stem length yet. I think it's dependent on weather. My second honorable mention is the Rudbeckia family. Here I have the Triloba variety that I overwintered, planting out again in the autumn time 6 to 8 weeks before our first frost last fall. I have found this variety does great this way. Again, I'm giving Rudbeckia an honorable mention because I haven't had the best luck with all varieties, but if I were you, I would definitely try them. And that is the list. I have more, but I'll save them for another day. Thank you for tuning in and giving me some time today. I encourage you to check out Lisa and Danielle's pages and podcasts and let me know what you think. I'm also more than happy to answer questions you have. I know this was a lot of information today. Look me up at Wild Bird Farm on any of the social media platforms, or leave me a message here on YouTube and I'll be happy to answer.